Hey y'all, hope everybody's having a safe quarantine. This is Mr. Delot for our third at-home assignment for U.S. history. This week we're going to be looking at the end of the Cold War, especially with the policies of American Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, that's the first Bush, and Soviet leaders Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. So first, we have to go way back to the 1970s when Nixon had pulled us out of Vietnam and was looking for a way to make our relationship with communist countries better around the world. And Nixon's idea was called Detente, and that just means relaxation or easing of tensions. And the idea behind this is that instead of containment, which we'd been using since World War II, we would try to ease tensions between us and the communists through peaceful talks and building up a good relationship. The main architect of this strategy was going to be Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who Kissinger had already been really involved in Nixon's administration. He actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for masterminding the ceasefire in Vietnam. And the first big part of Detente that Nixon and Kissinger want is a nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union, and that's going to be called SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. And SALT is a huge shift from the last 30 years of the Cold War, since, it's the first time that both sides agree to limit their nuclear missiles. This is huge. Think about the last 30 years from the end of World War II all the way up until this Detente. Both sides, the U.S. and Soviet Union, were doing nothing but building up more nuclear missiles, more nuclear weapons, and the ideas like brinkmanship and mutually assured destruction are kind of ruling everything. And we get that SALT treaty passed with the Soviet Union, and for the first time since the Cold War started, it looks like things are calming down. And China was actually even more open to the idea of Detente than the Soviet Union was. Nixon even visited China and met with Mao, and eventually we get a trading relationship and establish a overall pretty good relationship between the U.S. and China. And also, once they start making money trading with us, the Chinese government, even though it stayed officially communist, started to open up the Chinese economy to capitalism, and that's how China builds up its economy to become as powerful as it is today. But anyway, even with all this success and a landslide re-election in 1972, Nixon ends up resigning after the Watergate scandal, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, takes over in 1974. Now, Ford pardons Nixon and fails at fixing the bad economy from the 70s that y'all learned about last week. So Ford loses in 1976. Jimmy Carter is going to be the new president. Y'all have already learned about Carter's economic struggles in the 70s. And once Jimmy Carter takes over, he kind of ruins the détente between the U.S. and USSR because he calls the Soviets out on their terrible treatment of their own people. Because the Soviets were so bad on human rights, they didn't get along too well with Jimmy Carter. After the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Carter refuses to sign the SALT II treaty after the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And this officially ends Detente, and it causes tensions between our countries to skyrocket again, back to the way they were earlier in the Cold War. And with Afghanistan, the U.S. actually spends 10 years supporting Afghan rebels, including Osama bin Laden, actually. And the goal is to try and make the Soviets spend a ton of money and a lot of lives in Afghanistan, just like we had done earlier in Vietnam against soldiers that the Soviets had supported. And this is going to work. The Soviets are going to spend a lot of their time and money in Afghanistan, basically all of the 80s. Anyway, Carter doesn't stay around for more than one term. He's going to be beaten badly by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. And this is mostly because Carter had a hard time fixing the economy in the 70s, and Jimmy Carter looked really weak during a hostage crisis where Iranian terrorists took 52 Americans hostage for over a year. And so after 1979, Iran and the U.S. don't get along at all. And this will be important later. Anyway, Ronald Reagan gets elected in 1980 during a huge push towards conservatism, towards the right in the United States. And Iran releases the hostages the day that Reagan becomes president. And so when Reagan takes office, he's got to deal with already heightened tensions with the USSR. Reagan hated communism and the Cold War, especially because of the very real possibility that, like we talked about, at any moment the US and USSR could go to war and end the world. And Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. And he said that the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was basically just a suicide pact between our countries. So he's going to make defeating the Soviets and ending the Cold War a big part of his presidency. He knows that we need to beat the Soviets economically and strategically. And the good news for Reagan is that during his time in office, the U.S. economy is going to pull ahead of the USSR even more than it had. A big part of that is the Reaganomics policies that you learned about last week, tax cuts, deregulation, etc. And another big problem for the Soviets is that they're not just struggling because of a weak communist economy, they're also almost bankrupting themselves fighting a U.S.-backed war in Afghanistan. So that thing we talked about from 1979, we're going to spend all of the 80s backing up the Afghans against the Soviets. So it's a lot like the USSR's version of Vietnam. Reagan knows that we also need to win the strategic struggle, not just the economic struggle. And remember, he's not satisfied with the old idea of MAD, where everybody just builds up as many nukes as possible and hopes that nobody's crazy enough to launch. So Reagan starts something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. This is going to build up the military, and what Reagan hopes is going to happen is that it'll make nuclear weapons obsolete. And SDI gets rejected by Congress because it's going to cost too much. It would cost trillions of dollars, and it would have raised our national debt by a lot. And this plan was also called Star Wars because of the plan to use laser weapons on satellites up in space to shoot down Soviet missiles. Right, and this is pretty much, as serious as it sounds. If one side has laser cannons that they can shoot down the other side's missiles, this is a big deal, right? So the Soviets feel like they also have to have this technology, right? Because if we can shoot down their missiles, then we might have the chance to win a nuclear war. They have to have the technology. And this technology, the Star Wars tech, is actually insanely expensive to research and develop. And it really speeds up the bankruptcy of the USSR. And the best part of all this is that it was fake. It was, fairy dust. It's not real. Because in the 80s, this stuff doesn't even exist. But we made the Soviets believe that we had this technology. This is Reagan's masterstroke in speeding up the Soviet Union's economic collapse. So the Soviets go closer to bankruptcy because of Star Wars. Anyway, Reagan does still spend tons on national defense, even without Star Wars, and he builds up the U.S. military as a deterrent, kind of like brinkmanship, where he wants to look stronger to avoid the possibility of war. And a lot of his critics said that Reagan's ideas threatened to reignite an arms race in space. And even without a real Star Wars weapon system, a lot of the tech and ideas that are still around today. This research results in better computers, better satellite grid, and the ideas never really go away either, right? Like, we have a space force today. But while all this is happening here, there are some major changes happening over in the Soviet Union too. In 1985, a new guy takes over the Soviet Union named Mikhail Gorbachev. And the Soviet economy is already kind of a wreck when Gorbachev takes over because of communism and the war in Afghanistan. And so Gorbachev has to deal with this while at the same time trying to keep up with Reagan's military spending over here. But the problem is, if you probably noticed already, the USSR doesn't have any money. So Gorbachev realizes that the old hardline communism is not working. So he introduces two new policies. Those are going to be called Glasnost and Perestroika. Now, the first one, Glasnost, means openness, and it allows the people in the Soviet Union to speak much more openly about the government. And this is a big deal because, remember, this is what Stalin had killed millions of people for having political opinions. And it also gives the USSR basic freedom of the press, which is important. And now that the people in the USSR can talk about what they want, it's not going to be long until they get more freedoms, right? Now, Gorbachev's other big policy, Perestroika, means restructuring, and it allows people to move towards both free enterprise, or capitalism, and free elections. So we're moving towards an open economy and democracy. And so with these two policies, the Soviet dictatorship is on its last legs. Once the Soviet people get a taste of democracy and capitalism, what's going to happen? When people get some basic freedoms, when they get that little taste of democracy, you're not going to be able to take those things away. They're going to push for more and more freedoms. They're not going to give up those freedoms and go back to something like Stalin. We're going to see that Chinese realize the same thing later on and open up their economy as well. But with Gorbachev, the Soviets are really moving away from communism. Anyway, with Glasnost and Perestroika, people in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Poland, etc., they don't want to be controlled by a dictator in Moscow anymore. And now they can do something about it. So we see a lot of new nationalism pop up in each Soviet republic and the satellite nations in Eastern Europe. And a great example of that is something called the Solidarity Movement in Poland. And Poland breaks off and becomes a democracy in 1990. And all these other countries, you can see on this map here, break off from the USSR between 1989 and 1991, and the evil empire disintegrates in 1991. Now, inside the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, remember, is desperate to try to fix his economy. He knows that if he can get better relations with the U.S., he can cut military spending. And so what ends up happening is Gorbachev meets with Reagan a few times, and this culminates in when they sign the INF Treaty in 1987. Now, that's Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And the reason it's a big deal is that, one, INF reduces the nuclear arsenals of both the U.S. and USSR, which is a big deal. And two, it allows us to inspect each other's nuclear facilities. This is basically the opposite of brinkmanship in the arms race earlier in the Cold War, where we're both actually scaling down and we're letting each other check on it to make sure it's actually happening. But by the time INF gets signed, it's already too late for the Soviets. By 1989, tensions in Germany are fueled by Reagan's famous Berlin Wall speech. And in 1989, East and West Germany are going...
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In 1989, East and West Germany are going to tear down the Berlin Wall and reunite. And by 1991, the Soviet Union is basically just Russia. Gorbachev is going to resign, and the new Russian Federation, which is just what Russia is today, elects a guy named Boris Yeltsin to be the first democratic president of Russia. And the Cold War officially ends when George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin, they're going to meet in 1992. Now, as good as Reagan is doing with all this stuff, taking down the evil empire, ending the Cold War, he's not perfect. And in 1981, some stuff starts happening that's going to go on during Reagan's presidency, and it culminates in a big scandal for him. In 1981, Nicaragua, down in South America, was controlled by a communist group called the Sandinistas. And Reagan can't stand to have a communist country so close to the United States. So what Reagan does is he starts sending money to anti-communist rebels called the Contras. And the problem was that the Contras, even though they weren't communists, they sold lots and lots and lots of cocaine. And because of that, Congress had already made it illegal to help the Contras. Okay? Now, at the same time that the Contras and everything in Nicaragua are going on, Iran and Iraq go to war with each other, and we're secretly going to help Iran by selling them weapons, even though a bunch of Iranian terrorists and other groups backed by Iran had taken hostages and made attacks all throughout the 80s. So what happens is Reagan uses money we get from selling weapons to Iran, which is a bunch of terrorists, to pay the Contras, which is drug dealers, in direct violation of a law Congress had passed. So you can see why this is a problem. The official justification for all this was that we sent weapons to Iran to secure the release of American hostages that were held by an Iranian-backed terrorist group called Hezbollah. And what happens is a guy named Colonel Oliver North ends up taking all the blame here. He's kind of the fall guy. And when George Bush becomes president in 1989, he officially pardons everybody involved in this scandal. And the whole thing is known as the Iran-Contra affair, and it really hurts Reagan's image at the end of his presidency. Now, after Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, he's going to get elected in 1988, and he's riding the wave of Reagan's popularity. He had been Reagan's vice president. And what Poppy Bush does is he promises Americans, and of course,
read my lips. No new taxes.
And of course, being a politician, he never breaks his promise, right? Anyway, while Poppy's in the White House, there's also some trouble in China in 1989. This is at a place called Tiananmen Square, where in 1989, nothing happened at all. Wait. That's just the official Chinese government story. What really happened is a bunch of Chinese students were inspired by the growing democracy in the Soviet Union, and they decided to protest the government, specifically with a huge demonstration in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And because the government loved that idea so much, they responded by breaking up the protest with tanks. And the Tiananmen Square massacre is still a topic that's forbidden to even talk about in China today. And even though China's government officially says nothing happened, the casualties were probably in the thousands. Now, here in the U.S., Bush #1 doesn't do a lot to stop China, which was kind of his thing. He is instead going to focus on the breakup of the Soviet Union and some conflicts and troubles that are going on in the Middle East. So, with the USSR close to collapsing, Bush oversaw the signing of another big-time treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, which was originally proposed by Ronald Reagan. And what START does is set strict limits on the number of nuclear weapons that the U.S. and Soviet Union and Russia could have. And START is important because, y'all, this is the end of the arms race, basically. This is the most important disarmament treaty of all time because it cuts down and sets a cap on the number of nukes that either side can have. So that's it. The Cold War is officially over with Bush 41. So enter President Bill Clinton, and y'all will learn about him next week. But clearly, nothing could go wrong during his presidency, right?